Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here. I understand after lunch it's a bit difficult to stay focused. We'll try to entertain you as much as possible and make this panel as much interactive as possible. And I would like to ask the organizers to put the first question, interactive question, on the screen. I hope you know the rules, but you are opening Safari, scanning the code, then putting in the numbers, and you can see the question on your iPhone or tablet and choose the answer. And the answers are important for us to sort of understand what are your needs in order that we address them. Because as you know, and I'll be introducing the speakers in no particular order, but this is the sort of anonymous club of drinkers, or how you call it, because we have been discussing the same question of state ownership policy and the reform of state-owned companies and state-owned banks in general for a long period of time. We have our differences in terms of what needs to be done and in which priority. We have our different views on what we will be achieving and when, but I think we are here sharing the general understanding of why the state ownership policy is important and why the centralized ownership function is important, and why both of these elements, which are allegedly still missing in Ukraine, why the supervisory boards which are being established with the majority of independent members cannot bring the result which everyone expects from them, because as you know, it's difficult to meet someone's expectations unless you know the expectations, and unless that someone knows them as well and realizes them. So that's what we will be doing here. So introducing the speakers, Kateryna Rozhkova. She is essential element of the puzzle in this discussion because she represents regulator, and as you know, enhancement of the corporate governance of a company or of a bank is not possible if the sector regulation is not advanced and is not certain. Andriy Pyshny, who is the CEO of one of the largest state-owned banks, and we all know that for the management, the improvement of the corporate governance of the company he or she manages is extremely important, and we'll be discussing here what are Andriy's expectations as a manager in getting the state ownership policy and the centralized ownership function enhanced, especially with the adoption of the law on the improvement of the corporate governance of state-owned banks. Şevki here, in his many capacities, is essential as well, because first he is able to contribute and illustrate the example of how the reform of state-owned enterprises has been progressing, and why, and sort of, learn from both the successes and the mistakes or omissions, and contribute that to the reform of the state-owned banks, in order that the reform of the state-owned banks is more efficient, faster, or better accepted by the public. And Ivan Mikloš here, with us missing some of the speakers on our panel for obvious, very important reasons. Ivan, you will be representing the government here. And I'm sure you have developed already, with time you're spending in Ukraine, good understanding of what are the, thoughts on that side of the table. And we will here try to stimulate the discussion which needs to kick off and be launched in Ukraine in order to arrive at the state ownership policy and centralized ownership function. And I wanted just to mention that some things have been done already in that direction. EBRD, financed the project for the development of the state ownership policy. A document similar to or intending to be a state ownership policy has been adopted with respect to Naftogaz. Consultants are now working on similar documents for specific companies. We also have the government policy for state-owned banks, and we'll discuss discuss here whether or not that qualifies as the state ownership policy for state-owned banks. So there were steps done, but the community and the public still thinks that it's not ready. So please, starting from Kateryna, and ви будете розмовляти українською мовою.
You will speak Ukrainian, right? So I'd ask you, would you please tell us whether there is the policy of the state ownership in Ukraine? Does it exist in the banking sector or overall? And if not, why is that important? Well, the question is very broad because if we speak about the banking sector, so on the first sight it seems to me that we should say yes, this policy exists, because since 2016 the Cabinet of Ministers has adopted the strategy of the development of state-owned banks, then it was worked taking into account the privatization or nationalization of the Privatbank bank. The strategy foresees certain aims which are incredibly important and necessary, because any policy of ownership begins with the question why or what we want to achieve. But in my opinion, first of all, in spite of the general strategy document exists and is adopted by the Cabinet of Ministers, it is not sufficient enough, it's not high quality and not implemented in a proper way. And first of all, it's connected with not all of the state-owned banks have the properly formed supervisory boards. If we speak about the Privatbank, about Ukrzaliznytsia, this question is solved already and we can see real results. But if we speak about Oshchadbank or Ukrzaliznytsia, unfortunately for today corporate governance is not on the appropriate or sufficient level, I'd say. That is as for banks. So we have a document, its implementation is delayed, so the issue is open as for the formation of the supervisory boards, but in my opinion, still, we don't use enough efforts by the owner, though the owner is the Ministry of Finance and understands the importance of the implementation of the proper corporate governance for the sake of the achievement of results, but not enough things have been done. What can I say? Look, for instance, this issue, by the way, is broader still. How does the state maintain its property not only in the banking sector? For me, the simplest and most useful example is the strategy of the development of state-owned banks and the strategy of the development of Ukrainian post office, Ukrzposhta. Both Ukrainian post office and state-owned banks belong to the state. So it seems that their strategic plans should add to each other, and only then the state will get the biggest benefit and to expect for the best results. But, however, for today they don't have the unified approach. Because both Ukrzposhta and state-owned banks have their own strategic plans. Sometimes they intersect, sometimes they are just at the same playground, sometimes even interfering into each other's spheres. But the state loses, and doesn't only lose time, but loses the quality of services, loses the funds which it invests into the development and financing of their own property. And these are money of the budget of the taxpayers, and for today we don't have the transparent reporting mechanism, how the investment are taking place, what the results are, what we are expecting for, and so on. So those are big issues. In my opinion, if we speak about the state as an owner, for us not to deep into the history, because it's obvious that we have the huge bulk of state-owned enterprises is a historic legacy, so-called. That is why we should speak that there should be the certain unified and common property or ownership. We could speak about financial sphere or infrastructural sphere, about any sphere. On the one hand, they are totally diverse, and should be treated differently, but the principles of that governance are similar.
Корпоративне управління,
The
його
corporate
закони, вони
governance, its
однакові.
laws are
І,
similar.
на мій погляд, просто
And
не
in my
вистачає
opinion, we
єдиного
just have the
погляду.
lack
Це
of the
розрізнені погляди різних міністерств, хто кому
diverse, separate views
підпорядковується,
of different
кожен має свою окрему
ministries,
стратегію,
which
кожен її просувається,
subordination is
не
where
дивлячись,
and
що
who is
відбувається
trying to
поруч,
promote whom
чи є
without
якісь там
looking at each other and its
перетинання, або, можливо,
neighbors,
нема
whether they have any
синергії.
intersections,
От,
they
і
lack
тому про це,
synergy.
напевно, поговоримо трошки
So
пізніше,
maybe
тому
we'll
що
speak about that a
ясно,
bit later,
що
because
треба
it's
робити,
obvious what has
ну,
to
нам
be
принаймні,
done, at least to
зрозуміло.
us.
От,
It's
і
obvious.
хотілося б, щоб
And I'd like this understanding to be owned by all of the stakeholders.
у власника
The
і,
owner
власне,
itself,
у тих, хто отримує послуги від
himself to
державних
those who
компаній.
gets the services of the state-owned companies. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna. Mr. Andriy,
the
reform of governance of state-owned companies, when we had a requirement to create supervisory boards, the strategy just lacked, did not exist. The strategy of governance of state-owned companies or the strategy about every separate company, which has been adopted by all of the stakeholders. So in the case of the state-owned banks, knowing that the law is adopted and when it's signed, we do hope soon, will it be easier for you? Because do you think that the banking sector has this clear position? If not, how will you dwell with the issue of the profile creation for the supervisory board of Oshchadbank, your bank? Good afternoon. Thank you for your question. Well, first of all, I'd like to begin with the words that I deal with the state-owned banks, if I can calculate, for about 11 to 12 years. And I can observe the evolution which takes place in the issue of corporate governance and the attitude of the state as an owner, the efficiency, the political pressure, the quality of the portfolio, interaction with the international financial organizations, the suggestions of the regulator. And I can say that during the last 4 years, so many things have been done which never existed during the last 20 years. We've got, all of us, the necessary basic institutional principles for the reform of the corporate governance. The strategy of the development of the state banking sector during the last 2 years, even 2 strategies were adopted. The first was adopted when Privatbank was not there. The second strategy was adopted taking into consideration the factor of Privatbank. The National Bank deeply changed the approaches towards the construction of the risk management system, changed the legislation about the bank and banking activities. So today the reform of the corporate governance of the state banks is not the issue of the reform of the state banks. I would say that this is a different issue. This is the problem of their existence. We can now exist, taking into account all the legislation and regulation framework, knowing the transition into the international standards and reports, taking into account the requirements which are given to the system of the risk management systems in the banking system, including the state banks by the regulator. We cannot exist beyond those regulations. So when this law is signed, for me, this is just an issue of the time. This law on the system of corporate governance has been supported by the Parliament, and I'm sure it will be supported by the other authorities. It will be adopted. This is the issue of the existence of the state banks. Then we have a complicated process of the formation of supervisory boards. Whether we need them or not, well, undoubtedly we need them very much. I would gladly separate or maybe even bisect the responsibility as for the decision-making of 2 important points. First of all, the toxic portfolio. The portfolio has been formed up till 2014, which is for today still under the balance of the bank, and Oshchadbank may be the only state-owned bank which is at a systematic level works onto the issues of the financial restructurization using the so-called Kyiv approach, the law of Ukraine on the financial restructuring. For today, we restructured almost 10 billion hryvnia of the portfolio, and for today we are considering in the process of the financial restructuring restructuring, the cases we already using, there are 12 billion more. And 17 billion more are expecting for the certain decision for the beginning of the procedure of restructuring. So we are performing all the requirements of the law, and we're doing that consciously, using the procedure of the law on financial restructuring, because A, this procedure is transparent. It foresees the involvement and engagement of lots of consultants. It foresees the independent audit of the creditor. And for the bank, there are different options, beginning with the interest rate and ending with the lower price of the resources and some of the tax discounts. For us, it's really important because for the state-owned banks, such options like the commercial bank sector, which already has solved the problems for discounting issues or a use of any other infrastructural commercial things of amortization or depreciation for the credit portfolio. They were never acceptable to us. I don't even know which dialogue should be with the law enforcement authorities if we would just had the procedure of the indulgence or writing off debt. I think that the next day we would have the guests, which would then show all of that in the Ukrainian news. So the law on the financial restructuring is very important for us. So I would gladly share this responsibility about so many problematic assets which need to be solved. I would definitely share that with the supervisory board. The next one is social function and commercialization of the activities. The strategy of the development of our bank, and by the way, we gained a unique document, which is for the first time in the history was adopted at the level of our shareholder at the Cabinet of Ministers or government meeting. This strategy foresees that the bank, besides lots of ambitious plans, still has to provide the social function, which is precisely defined, yes. And it foresees for us, as for the management of the bank, the search of a rather complicated compromise with the social function and commercialization of the efficiency of our activities. I could say that without even waiting for the strategy, according to the decisions which were made in 2014 when we offered to adopt the plan of optimization of the network, we had the certain cut of this network, which allowed the bank to cut our expenses to have this network for 700 million hryvnia a year. If we compare it, for instance, the shocking losses as for the system of the state-owned Oshchadbank because of the annexation of the Crimea and war at Donbass is approximately 700 points of sales. And optimization of the affiliated network through the geolocation, through the economic efficiency, through the change of the business model format is the cut of 2,000 more affiliations. Now we have approximately 3,000 of them. Now we have approximately 250,000 clients at the rural areas, and now we have the social function conducted through the distant schemes of serving the population, through our mission conducted in the so-called red zone of the joint forces operation of Ukraine. This is the former zone of anti-terroristic operation. We have mobile, unique branch banks working there, or banking outlets there. There are 5 of them, and they serve the whole client flow which comes from the territory which is not under control of Ukraine. Those developments were unique for us, so this is the part of the social function. There are some more points which are maybe not that interesting for the audience, but still, Oshchadbank is the first bank in the Eastern Europe which systematically served the people with disabilities. We opened the first in the Eastern Europe outlet or banking center, and there are 17 of them now, which is totally adjusted to the requirements of the World Health Organization to totally give the services to the people with disabilities, and we are trying to multiply this experience and making it cashless. So there are total things which are our mission. There are things which we are implementing, but of course they cost money. I would like this dialogue to take place not only between the board and the owner, who is interested to implement this social function, but between the independent supervisory board, which would include at least 6 independent members, and the owner. And then it would be much more full of sense and substantiated. From the point of view of the problems how to form the supervisory board, it is a huge problem. The law on the foresees that the supervisory board has to be prepared, and this report has to be approved by the independent audit according to the results of the year. The question of responsibility, the issue of qualification, the issue of internal regulations, the issue of cooperation, all of those issues which, after the formation of the new supervisory board, will have to implement together with the strategy of the development of the bank and to begin the work of all of the above mentioned. But without that, to speak about any perspective of the bank, I wouldn't even speak about that. This change of the corporate governance system is necessary and compulsory for our existence. The change of the corporate governance is necessary and compulsory to improve our cooperation and strategic cooperation with the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And this is the further issue of privatization, because the state, as for the further fate of Oshchadbank, has already defined the fate. They should take into account the capital, and the first stage foresees the involvement of the EBRD and then the development of this success through the public shares. Thank you, Andriy. As far as I understand, the first 2 speeches are the following. We have the strategy. Maybe it's a bit too slow as for its implementation, or maybe it doesn't answer all of the issues of the funding of the social function, but overall, it exists. Şevki.
In your capacity as the chairman of the board of a state-owned company, do you think, and obviously I take it for granted that everyone in the audience is aware that although supervisory boards with majority of independent board members are being established at the state-owned companies, the scope of their authorities is a bit different from what the best practice and the standards and the consultants advised. And so, you know, the boards are a bit restrained in their capacity to achieve the results. Do you think if the state ownership policy is developed and exists for the state-owned companies, will it be easier for the government to sort of entrust more powers into the independent boards?
Let me try to make an analogy here. Clearly, this government and the previous governments have moved down the path of embracing the principles of corporate governance for state-owned enterprises, but the political spectrum, of course, covers more than just the government itself. And there are a number of still politicians in the Rada for whom the corporate governance is like your 18-year-old daughter. You will allow her to go out and have the board meeting until late, but you want her to be back by midnight. And this is, at the moment, the reality. And your reference to whether or not there is enough empowerment, the short answer is not yet. And my board, we have prepared a number of changes to empower the supervisory board with basic governance authority. We presented to the government, and we are hopeful that those changes will take place because they don't require necessarily parliamentary approval. They are within the domain of the government. But if we really look back into why Ukraine has underperformed over the last 26 years, people could say this, that, corruption. No, I would say it is lack of governance, because it is the lack of governance that leaves space for corruption. It is the lack of governance that leaves incompetent management in place. It is the lack of governance that allows to be untransparent, and a number of things that, unfortunately, in the past have constrained our economic development in this country. So, to the extent that we can change that mindset, we realize that, yes, the state, the people of Ukraine are the owners, and they have the ultimate authority to make key guiding decisions, principles for the supervisory board, and that's what you're referring to as a state ownership policy. And you and I have discussed a lot, there needs to be at two levels. One, at the broader level of state ownership policy as to why certain activities still should be conducted by the state. And then at the individual enterprise level, this would set the framework for the board of directors, then to set the strategy, set the plans, assess the management, whether or not it's fit for that particular strategy, and work in the best interest of all stakeholders. Because the key role of the supervisory board is to balance the interest of the variety of stakeholders that each enterprise has, not just the state as the shareholder, but the customers, suppliers, the public, all those interest groups that the institution is supposed to serve, their interest is supposed to be balanced by the board. And that is where this empowerment, assignment of responsibility to the board within the guidance, within the framework of the state ownership policy comes into play. That's what it's all about. Giving the powers, but also the accountability for delivering the results to the professionally selected people. And if they can't deliver, to change them with those that can do it there. So that is, I think, a very long answer to your short question. As we move along the path of changing the concept of, or the understanding of what state ownership is about among our various politicians, that will work for the benefit of our country.
Thank you, Şevki. Ivan, well, to me, in state-owned company sector, there is no formalized or published state-owned policy. But maybe internally, inside the government, there is a state ownership policy which is in minds and in hearts, and it's clear what are the objectives, next steps, priorities. It just, there is no legal mechanism to introduce it, or no time, or other reasons. Is that so, or it's being developed? How do you assess the current situation with the state ownership policy in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, I'm not ready and prepared to speak on behalf of the government. I'm not a member of the government, and especially I'm not ready speaking in this area on behalf of the government. Why? Because from the beginning, I was very skeptical regarding possibility and efficiency of the government policy in state-owned companies. And from beginning, I was convinced deeply that the best solution is minimize as much as possible state-owned sector, and to solve this problem by privatization, of course, transparent, open, professionally managed privatization. And then focus, of course, then we have to focus how to solve the problem in these minimum companies. After spending here now around 40 years, I'm even more convinced about the importance of this and about illusionary kind of plans that we can effectively manage state-owned companies. Let me give you a few figures which are, I think, very important, because finally, but I have to start by saying that in many areas it was done during the last 4 years a lot. Unfortunately, we are now speaking about area in which it was almost no result. I agree with Mr. Pyshny that yes, there are results, especially in banking sector, thanks to National Bank, new rules, supervision, and so on. Related party crediting and all these issues, increasing capital. This is really achievement. But speaking about results all other state-owned companies, I'm afraid. Okay, we have few examples where the independent supervisory boards were established, but still privatization is not going on, which means this real solution is not. We have new law. Fortunately, now process was started, but we lost 4 years. Why it is important? Because by last decision of the government, it was passed this triage, which means how many companies will be privatized. It is only 9% of assets of the companies which are in triage, designated for privatization. At the same time, it is agreement here, and even those who are against privatization are saying yes, state-owned companies are a huge source of corruption, political clientelism, inefficiency, and so on. Which means, if we want to privatize only 9% of assets, then we are saying that we are doing a real solution of this problem only by very minor part, 9%. Because speaking about corporate governance principles, OECD for instance, it is nice. But it is necessary to know that this is potential problem everywhere. That the risk of inefficiency and not only corruption, but also corruption and inefficiency is simply higher. And then we are speaking about specific Ukrainian conditions, which are not only Ukrainians, which were in my country, and I'm speaking because my own experience. When I came to power, and I was in 4 governments, we quickly recognized that the really only solution is privatization. And we privatized what was possible to privatize as soon as possible. Because one of the problems is, and it is not possible to underestimate, that for functioning effectively, like in Scandinavian countries, OECD principles of corporate governance, you have to have very well functioning formal and informal rules. Rule of law, low corruption, very high standard of public administration, very long-term transparent environment. Don't forget that in Sweden, for instance, Freedom of Information Act was approved in 1773, which means I am convinced that yes. And then we have also a problem which exists also in publicly traded big companies, and it is from economic theory well-known principal agent problem. It is information asymmetry and motivation asymmetry. Those who are running the company, especially if you are speaking about big companies, those people have much more information about those who are controlling them, either owners or representatives of state as owner, which means they have very information asymmetry, and also motivation is not the same. Those who are running this business and those who are owners or representative of owners. And if you are speaking about state ownership, of course it is also even bigger problem, especially in conditions which are like they are in Ukraine. Which means, in my opinion, very important is, and then my answer to your question is that I really don't know. I really don't know, and because in principle, I'm supporter of limited government. And in principle, I don't think that it is good in principle to have to ask bank to fulfill some social functions. Why? I understand that in ATO there are conditions, or in small regions where commercially it will be not maybe done. But it is very easy to just outsource this, to just order on commercial basis from the state to commercial, fully privately owned banks to fulfill this. And you will have competitive conditions, you will take better conditions, I think, and you will not create problem of conflict of these functions in one state-owned bank. Because then it is easy to say, or to apologize, potentially, I'm not speaking about any concrete bank, but to say, okay, we didn't have such kind of profitability because we had to fulfill also these social functions and so on and so on. Which is speaking about banking sector, I don't see any reason to have state-owned banks. In Slovakia, we privatize all banks. In Estonia, they privatize all banks. And when financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, we didn't have any problem with this. We didn't spend no euro, either nor in Estonia nor in Slovakia. On the contrary, Slovenia, which has still a lot of banking sector, but also other companies state-owned, they had a lot of problems. They had to spend a lot of money for covering, for sustaining these banks, and also corruption problem is there much higher in connection with these state-owned companies. Which means, very briefly, my strategy could be in this area to privatize what is possible privatize, and it's possible to privatize almost everything. But for Ukraine to have possibility to privatize much more, it will be necessary to restructure such companies like Naftogaz and Ukrzaliznytsia, to stay in the state ownership only what is natural monopoly. What is natural monopoly controlled by independent professional regulator and open market also for other private companies or other companies to use this natural monopoly and to create competition. And this is not theory. This is what we did in Poland, what we did in Slovakia, and other countries. Because without a restructuring and privatization of these companies and banking sector as well, you will have this situation that we have, which is very strange. Ukraine has 3,500 state-owned companies. About half are non-functioning, but still it is about 1,800. And when we tried to find some candidates for big privatization, so-called large privatization, which means big companies which can attract really strong strategic investors, we couldn't find 10. Finally, we found 5, but even this was the problem. Which means, sorry that I'm not speaking mostly about corporate governance of the state-owned companies, but this problem is very important. Because if we are concentrating, Ukraine has a lot of problems. It is necessary to concentrate on the most important decisions and most important reforms. And among most important reforms, I am fully 100% convinced is privatization, but not 9% of assets, but restructuring and privatization of the most important part of Ukrainian economy, which is still in state ownership. Banking sector, utilities, and other important companies.
In other words, you can bypass the corporate governance processes if you privatize them. The private sector will take care of it by itself, and you don't have to go through the struggles.
Thank you for an opening and an answer to my first question and also to the second question which I wanted to ask. Does Ukraine need to have a state-owned banks? But we'll discuss it. But just to make sure I understood, out of 3,000 state-owned companies, there are like 50 top, right? 50, So you think that it is doable in Ukraine to privatize 50 companies ASAP?
If we are speaking about assets or turnover, you can see that just few companies are creating 90%. And this is important, that but of course you cannot privatize, you can, but it is difficult to privatize Ukrzaliznytsia or Naftogaz as it is today, which means you have to restructure before, but they have to start. If this process will not start it now, when you will start? Which means, problem is that if we are speaking only about this, what is possible to privatize now, we are speaking about just not important part, which means we are speaking that we are not ready then to solve the problem of also inefficiency, corruption, bad management, and so on. Because, in this, even if we will be able, and we know how it is going slowly and how difficult to create this independent supervisory board in big companies. It took 5 years and we have just few, yeah? But even if you are doing this problem of principal agent problem and even having potential of political interfering to these state-owned companies still is there. We are decreasing it if we have good supervisory board, but still it is not solving the problem. And it is not only about corporate governance, how it is managing. It is also about direct foreign investment. Because investors are bringing not only new culture, new corporate governance, they're bringing also money, new investment, new markets, and so on, which means it is broader. And from more reasons, it is important to start this process and to diminish state ownership in economy.
Okay, thank you. To me, this discussion is, if we put the conclusions in writing, that will be the state ownership policy, because in fact, what it does, it answers the question, what needs to be privatized, when and how, what needs to be liquidated. Like in Ukraine, this is another big area, and hopefully we'll get there, because it's quite difficult, challenging to impose good standards which are relevant for Oshchadbank or Ukrzaliznytsia on companies which are not operating and which don't need to exist. So, and there are some companies, a lot, so which are dragging the progress because it's, you can't make a law which will be relevant only for these specific companies because, it just look bad. But then the social function, then the financing of the social function, and then what and how the companies which need to remain like national monopolies need to be managed. All of those questions are basically the bullet points of the draft of the state ownership policy, be it a document or just a discussion and conclusion and something existing in the minds or on the slides. Doesn't matter the format. What matters is that it's identified, everyone, all the stakeholders are on the same page with respect to these questions, and there is a continuous process of renewal, update, and monitoring the implementation. Now when we come to implementation, what do you think, Kateryna, що ви думаєте має бути зроблено
What do you think needs to be done to implement the strategy for the state banks, which exists now? Well, let's assume there is the strategy that we need to privatize. We have the understanding what the preconditions are. So what needs to be done? And whether I understand it correctly, that the supervisory boards, which have to be formed according to the new law, their profile will be to prepare the state-owned banks for privatization process. I do hope you're right. Or maybe I am even sure it is right. Because, by the way, I'd like to have a short remark to support Mikloš. My personal, I'm sure personally, and what we in fact discuss in the National Bank, that really privatization is a kind of medicine of bad corporate governance, because the private investor always takes care about all of the processes, maybe in a more efficient way. So if we speak about the state-owned banks, precisely here, again, we have the understanding that the state, in fact, for today, has to, well, we have such a target function. We have to take not more than 30% at the financial market. Today, this indicator is approximately 60% after the nationalization of Privat Bank. And it's understandable what we need to do with each of the banks. And about two of them, Privat Bank and Ukrzaliznytsia, there are more or less precise roadmaps with predefined steps. So we have two more state-owned banks about which we need to conduct this work by the supervisory boards, which will be elected. Can we now rather quickly privatize the state-owned banks? The answer is no. And we can see it on the example of Ukrzaliznytsia, which is the closest to the moment when it can change the owner, or at least to get an additional owner besides the state. Because any private investor has certain requirements for the structure of the assets. It's not a secret if I tell you that the state monopolies for today are credited in the state banks. And for instance, as for Ukrzaliznytsia, which elected the strategy of EcoBank, we can see certain wishes from the potential investor that its balance should be decreased or for the share of the state monopolies. So then there is a question. Where should the state monopolies go if we want to privatize all of the state-owned banks? Where they will be served, where they will take loans during the period when we do understand that the external markets are still not open for us. And our state monopolies, well, let's not hide that, they have some problem with the debts they have already. For instance, Ukrzaliznytsia, Ukrainian railway, which pays to one bank and does not pay to the other, goes to the court to have certain credit
певні
credit
лутхолси нашого
contracts, court
законодавства,
file, using the gaps in the
то
legislation.
питання
So the issue
потенційної
is of the
приватизації
potential
державних
privatization
банків
of the state-owned banks
напряму пов'язано
is
з
directly
питанням
connected with the issue
корпоративного
of the
управління в
corporate
державних
governance of
монополіях.
the state monopolies.
Тому що незалежні
Because
спостережні
the
ради цих
independent
державних
supervisory
монополій
boards of
повинні
those state monopolies
таким же чином
have
визначити і
to
затвердити
define
стратегічні
and to
плани їх
approve the strategic
розвитку,
plans of their
розібратися з тим
development,
фінансуванням
to
і боргами,
understand
які
the
є,
funding and debts which
визначитися з
exist
тим,
already, to
що є
define
цільовою
what's the
функцією,
target function,
і почати рухатися
and to begin to
в вірному
move
напрямку.
in the proper direction.
Тоді ці державні
Then
монополії
those state
зможуть спокійно
monopolies will
виходити
be
на
able
внутрішні
to
і
go to their
зовнішні
internal and
ринки,
external markets,
маючи стратегію
having
розвитку,
the strategy of
довгострокові
development,
плани,
long-term
фінансові,
plans,
в тому числі,
financial plans including,
бізнес-плани,
business plans,
залучати
to
запозичення,
involve
врешті-решт
different
виходити на
loans
конкурсні
and to have
умови,
the
а
competition
не
conditions and not
використовувати
only to
єдину для них
use
можливість
the only
державні банки на
opportunity, the
сьогоднішній день.
state-owned
І
banks.
це ж таки знову впливає
And still
на
it
фактичну
impacts
імплементацію
again onto the
корпоративного
implementation of the
управління і
corporate
стратегії в
governance
державних
and
банках.
strategy in the
Тому що як ми
state-owned
можемо
banks?
сьогодні
Because
говорити,
how can we
що
speak that, say that
Національний банк
the National
розробив
Bank has
ряд вимог,
developed
є нові
several
регуляції.
requirements, there
Ми
are
розуміємо,
new
як ми будемо
regulations, we do
імплементувати,
understand
і
how we
Мінфін, до речі,
implement,
нам
and the
тут
Ministry of Finance
абсолютно, він з нами на одній
totally
сторінці,
is
на
at the
одному
same
боці,
page
ми
with
знаємо, що ми
us,
будемо робити,
because we
але ми
know
не
what
можемо
we'll
просуватися
do, but
далі,
we
тому що,
cannot move on
дивіться,
because
що таке корпоративне
what the
управління
corporate
державною
governance of the
власністю? В
state-owned
першу чергу воно
property is.
після питання
First of
навіщо,
all,
і яка
after
мета,
the question
повинно
why, what's the
забезпечити
aim,
рівні
it has to
конкурентні умови
provide
для
the
всіх.
equal
Тобто держава як регулятор це
competitive
одне,
conditions
держава
for
як власник
everyone.
це
The
зовсім
state
інше.
as regulator
Ми
is
сьогодні
one
говоримо
thing, the
про
state as
державні
an
банки,
owner
які
is a
мають
different thing.
знову
We're
ж таки
speaking
легасі
about the state-owned
історичне,
banks which have
мають
historical legacy,
спеціальні
they
окремі
have the
умови від
special
Національного банку, тому що державні
separate
підприємства в них
conditions from the National
сконцентровані
Bank,
дуже сильно,
because the
що
state-owned
де-факто
enterprises are
порушує,
concentrated there, which
призводить до
violates
порушення ряду нормативів.
certain regulations.
І сьогодні, якщо ми говоримо про рівні
So
умови, то
today,
ми
if we
повинні
speak about
застосувати
equal
санкції.
opportunities, we need
Якщо
to
ми говоримо
use
про
the sanctions.
державницький погляд,
If we
розуміючи
speak about
наслідки
the
тієї
state
страшної
view,
кризи,
point
про
of
яку ми
view,
пройшли,
understanding the
ми говоримо
consequences
про
of
те,
the
що
crisis,
окей, добре, ми ще
we're saying,
потримаємо ці
okay,
спеціальні умови,
let us
але, будь
have those
ласка,
special
незалежні
conditions
спостережні
still, but
ради
please, independent
великих
supervisory
державних
boards
монополій.
of the big state
Зробіть
monopolies,
що-небудь.
do something.
4 роки
For the 4
ми
years,
хочемо і приходимо в
we are
Мінекономпром і
coming to the
спілкуємося
Ministry
і
of
говоримо,
Economic
давайте
Development,
почнемо
we're
хоча б
communicating
з
with them
Нафтогазу і
and suggesting,
залізниці.
let's begin with
Давайте
Naftogaz and
разом
Ukrzaliznytsia. Let's
сядемо
together
і
sit
подивимося
down
на
at the table
перспективу,
and look at
що
the
можна
perspective,
зробити,
what can
щоб
be
ми
done
не
for
подовжували
us
ці
not
вейвери
to
кожного
prolong those
року.
waivers every
А люди
year.
добрі, щоб ми
But,
зрозуміли,
dear
хай це буде
people, for us to
7-річний,
understand, let it
10-річний
be a
період, але
7-year,
давайте його
10-year
затвердимо
term,
і
but let
будемо
us approve
поступово
that
йти
and
до
gradually
зниження
will decrease
обсягу
the amount
активно-пасивних операцій в
of
державних
active
банках.
passive operations
Що це
in
за
the
постанови
state
Кабміну,
banks?
коли ми
What's
говоримо
the
всі
decree
є
of the Cabinet of
держпідприємства,
Ministers if we are
зарплатні
saying that
проекти,
all of the
все тільки в державних
state-owned
банках? Це хіба
enterprises are in the
конкуренція?
state-owned banks?
Відповідь ні.
Is it the competition? The answer is no.
Це всі відкриті питання,
All of
вони,
those are open
тому,
questions.
коли ми говоримо про
So
державні
when we're
банки,
speaking
ми
about the
повинні розуміти,
state-owned
ну,
banks, we
банківська
need to
функція – це, в
understand the
принципі,
banking
сервіс.
function is in
Якщо
fact a
вона,
service.
банківська функція
If
– це
the banking
дериватив від
function is,
економіки.
it's a derivative of economy.
Розумієте?
You see?
Якщо основний актив
So if the
працює
main
неправильно,
asset
дериватив не
works
може
in an
бути
appropriate
правильним.
way, the derivative
Якщо в основному
cannot be
активі
proper.
корпоративного
If the main
управління
asset of the
нема,
corporate
то
guidance
дериватив не буде
does
таким.
not exist, the
Він
derivative
є
will
похідним.
not exist.
Він
It
буде
is
абсолютно
just the
віддзеркалювати ці
result.
всі
It will
недоліки.
totally mirror all
Тому
the drawbacks.
зрозуміло, що треба визначитися з пріоритетами. І я абсолютно підтримую
So, of
вас,
course, we need
що
to
треба
define the
визначитися
priorities,
з
and
тими
I
об'єктами,
totally
які необхідно
support you that we need to
приватизувати.
define the
Робити це
objects we need to
якнайшвидше,
privatize,
готувати
to
їх і
do
таке
it as
інше.
soon as
Але
possible, to prepare them.
паралельно
But
треба все-таки
simultaneously,
по
we
тих,
still need,
можливо, по тих
maybe according to those
підприємствах, які держава в силу тих чи
which the
інших
state,
причин
because of these or those reasons,
має намір залишити
has
за
an
собою.
intention to
Тому що це, це ж не Україна придумала
still to be
у всьому світі є
state-owned,
державні підприємства, коли
because the
держава
whole world has
через них
state-owned
реалізує
enterprises.
свою функцію
When the state
соціальну,
implements its social function through those
забезпечуючи
enterprises,
суспільство.
providing the
Тому
society.
там треба працювати і вже
There
вчора
we need to
працювати
work.
над
And even we
корпоративним
needed to work
управлінням.
yesterday
І,
on the
Катерино,
corporate
ми будемо
guidance.
працювати над
Miss Kateryna,
управлінням
we'll work
state-owned
on the
companies.
guidance
Ми
of the state-owned
насправді
companies.
працюємо.
And we do
Шевкі
work on that.
почув
Şevki has heard
прохання
the request
kind request to the board of Ukrainian Railways from the National Bank of Ukraine. І єдиний на панелі, хто ще
So the
не
only
висловився
person
з
at
того
the panel
питання, чи
who
потрібні
never spoke
Україні
whether
державні
Ukraine
банки
needs
і
the
як
state-owned
довго,
banks and for
це
how
пан
long
Андрій.
is
І
Mr.
я вас
Andriy.
попрошу відкоментувати
So could you comment
коротко, якщо можна,
very
тому що
short,
я
please, because
сподіваюся, в
I
залу
do
вже виникли
hope
питання,
the
після
audience
того, як
has
ми
the
майже
questions
написали
already
тут
after
державну
we
політику
almost wrote
власності.
the whole state policy of ownership.
Я спробую максимально
I will try to be as short as possible. In a nutshell, it seems to me that privatization is not a unique exercise. It has been coped by all of the countries of the European Union, of the Eastern Europe, and rather successfully. We need lots of things to analyze, what to watch. The only thing is, really, the state has defined about the further fate of the strategy of the development of banking sector as it is. So it defines how the functions will be distributed, or the commercial burden onto the banking sector will be distributed, knowing that the priority of the state exit out of the 100% shareholders' ownership is still there. As for the monopoly, well, you know, it's a very complicated topic for us, because you know that Oshchadbank has a very long history of relationship with the state-owned companies, and it has been diverse, rather different. We cannot say that the delay, and especially of the state monopolies, is zero. That's an efficient market of expiration. We want expiry of period, we want to work with it, and we have certain competency. This competency has been verified by our partners, even from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, knowing that they have a very certain requirement for the volume of the state portfolio in the credit portfolio should decrease. We should diversify ourselves, and we are working actively on that, the small and medium business and the retail. But whether the competency on the work with the big corporate segment should stay, I'm sure it should stay. Yes, we really own this competency, and we want to develop it. Whether this cooperation between the state banks and the state monopoly creates certain non-market conditions, my answer is no, it does not. Because for today, the state monopolies engage the credits resources using the tender procedure. Look at Prozoro and look, just watch. The state and owned enterprises Energorinok has the Prozoro request, and you can see everything in the online mode. Why the tender procedures is not used by other banks with the Western capital, with the commercial capital? I've got a rhetorical question, so let it be open for the audience. We are working in this segment, we are working rather efficiently. The National Bank consciously and totally consequently going with certain waivers. Those waivers, which are historical, they are being decreased. I'd like to remind you one thing. Oshchadbank, an example of 2014, had 20 billion of pre-term funding. The Oshchadbank of 2017, zero loans of refunding. Everything came back. As for the issue of the social function, you know, it is a very painful topic for me. I wanted to share the monopoly with the commercial banking sector in the grey zone. You know, along the perimeter of the anti-terroristic operation. Why not? I don't see Raiffeisen there. I don't see Ukrzaliznytsia there. Where are you, dear colleagues? Let us work there. We are having the certain technology which can be given, and you can just look at that. Those are moving outlets, and they have really nicely equipped rooms where you can hide during the shelling, both the clients and the workers. The routes are working, the regulations. Just take it, use it. Where are you? So take this monopoly from us, please. So this is the situation. It is a bit controversial, I would say. If we're speaking about the privatization, yes. If we speak about that, it can't be happening just at an instant. We should think about that. One more thing I'd like to announce here about the Ukrainian post office, Ukrzaliznytsia. I do not understand the economic sense of this discussion around the creation of another state bank. Please deal with the 4 state-owned banks which exist already and then create another one. If we speak about the social function, let us work on collaboration first. We are ready. Our suggestions are on the table of all of the heads of Ukrainian post office since 2014. I personally signed several memorandums. If you don't like them, let's work together and develop some different ones. Let's not create one more bank. It's not needed for the work in the rural areas. For the social function, let's work on the technological issues. Let's work on the technologies of the teleserving. Let's work together and calculate and distribute the client flows. But all of that is work which we need to take. And the last issue. Who will have the responsibility on the preparation of privatization plan? My answer, the supervisory board. The formed supervisory board of highly qualified experts, 6 independent directors, 3 dependent ones. We will cooperate with them. But honestly speaking, I'm apologizing, but this is the zone of responsibility of the supervisory board. We have what to say, we have certain plans, but again, in this part, I really would like to have an opportunity as the head of the board to share the responsibility and to involve the experts which need to be in the supervisory board. I do hope for that so much. And there is nothing ironic in that. I'm totally sincere with you. Mr. Andriy, do not scare off the potential clients to the supervisory board with such a huge responsibility, because this is the second element you're mentioning. This will be the responsibility, that will be the responsibility. That's not true. Isn't that true? It's true. This is the discussion I'd like maybe to have a separate one, another round table, not this one. Let's speak about that, where the sphere of responsibility begins, where it ends. I'd like to add from my behalf that the responsibility zone of the supervisory board is written in the legislation and regulations, so we can debate about that. But okay, I do agree with Andriy, but there's nothing scary about that, honestly speaking. I would like to comment upon that about the Ukrainian post office, as this issue is, well, maybe since 2015 we are discussing it between ourselves, together with the Ukrainian post office, or separately. It seems to me it would be a nice idea, and this is an example how different ministries having similar structures do not see the forest behind the trees.
Кожне з них собі розробляє свою окрему стратегію, а 2 компанії чи 3 компанії не можуть домовитися, тому що кожна з них вирішила, що вона хоче бути лідером ринку. І Укрпошта, коли прийшла до Національного банку з тим, щоб отримати банківську ліцензію, вона сказала, що в мене є проблеми, тому що в мене є соціальна функція, не тільки в Укрпошті теж, причому подібна, якщо я правильно розумію. Але банки із своїм кешлесом, із своїми технологіями відбирають в мене доходи, тому мені треба стати банком. Тому, що було б добре зробити, можна було б Укрпошту передати до Мінфіну. Тоді би змінити власника. Тоді би, можливо, хоча б в цьому напрямку питання би вирішилося б скорше і ефективніше.
Mr. Andriy, we have a question from the audience. I do like the interactive character of our discussion, but I'd like to involve the audience now. I saw the question over there. We need the microphone, please.
Andriy, EBRD. I'm glad to see that the passion has not left Ukraine, so there is always enough passion about these discussions. But let me take a step back from the heat of the moment. I'm fully with Ivan to say that the corporate governance compliance at the state companies will always be more difficult, because these companies will always be political, at least more political than the private sector. Let me make 2 specific proposals how to perhaps reduce the political aspect of it. Number 1, to nominate members to the boards of the state enterprises, I think there has to be a separate independent nomination committee. Indeed, the relevant minister in the end would need to sign off, but I would not give the minister the right to come up with candidates. Perhaps to have a veto is okay, but then the minister needs to argue with the committee, and the committee should contain private sector people, academia, and perhaps some civil servants, but not politically driven people, technocrats rather than politicians.
Andriy, we have that already. We already have that functioning.
So that's fantastic. Now, proposal number 2, at the state enterprises, I think you should also have a scorecard and KPI that is similar to private sector and that is not being mingled based on, specific wishes or specific times and years. Thank you.
Thank you. Ivan, you wanted to...
No reaction, not on this, because I agree, but what Mrs. Rozhkova said in connection what was said now, because this is very important. I understand that situation is difficult. I understand that state-owned banks are dealing especially with state monopolies, which have all debts and so on and so on, but what we are speaking about is that we have part of economy which is working on soft budgetary constraints. And we have to solve this as soon as possible to solve this, because if we will not solve this, then for what you will have nice, independent, professional members of supervisory board? What kind of KPI will you have? How it will be competition with the normal sector, which is working in hard budgetary constraints? Which means I understand that situation is very, very difficult. It was also in my country. In 1999, we started this process. What we did, we simply cleaned banking sector. 3 biggest state-owned banks, it costed 12% of GDP. It was unbelievably expensive. We imposed bankruptcy law, which means we imposed hard budgetary constraint to both of these sectors. And then we simply privatized it, which means we started in 1999. It was the similar situation like here in Ukraine. In 2001, 2002, these banks were restructured, privatized, new bankruptcy law, hard budgetary constraints, and it works. Which means I know the situation is difficult. I'm just saying that we lost 4 years. And it is impossible to lose another 5 years. It is necessary to start as soon as possible to solve this problem. Because if we will argue that, yeah, it is impossible because this all debt which was inherited and so budgetary, then we will never solve the problem.
And if I may add to that, I think the issue of getting out of this vicious cycle of who's going to finance state-owned enterprises if you don't have state-owned banks can be broken only by making state-owned enterprises financially strong and independent. So gradually, it's not a from one day to next solution, but as you bring these enterprises to be credible institutions, not only then state-owned banks, other institutions will start looking at them more interestingly, but also in the process of selling of some stakes in the state-owned banks, that will not be seen as a sort of a stone around the neck of state-owned banks. So you have to start from where the problem is, and the problem really is state-owned enterprises have not been run for the purposes of being commercially viable enterprises, and we need to resolve that issue.
All right, Andriy, you had a question?
Can I give a small comment as well? A very short comment. My name is Andriy. I work on the advisory team of the cabinet, which is led by Ivan Mikloš. And I hold a PhD in corporate governance, so I would be tempted to promote it as much as possible. But in the past 3 years in Ukraine, I've come to realize the limitations of that intervention. And compared to privatization, it is always a second best solution. There are 2 situations in which it is necessary. One is when the state has to perform a certain, let's call it a social function through owning a company. And the other one is when the road to privatization, like in case of Oshchadbank, is going through a stop called corporate governance reform. But another more important limitation is that, and I think I will address this question to Şevki in his rare capacity as a Turk, and refer to the recent example of President Erdogan appointing himself the head of the State Property Fund of Turkey.
And his son-in-law as his chairman, vice chairman.
Yeah, so that's a risk that we have not been contemplating so far. So what do you think about that?
Okay. I think, and in the discussions we've been having over the past 4 or 5 years, I personally am opposed to creating a super monster. that collects all the assets of the state. Because when you create such superpower, all the people who are seeking to create rent will focus one way or another and achieve, through a variety of means, influence, if not to say control, over the way in which the superstructure then will work. So in trying to resolve the issue of how to more effectively manage the state ownership, you can be shooting yourself in the foot if you created the superstructure. I think what is important is this, the salami method. You know, you have to divide the problem into manageable bits, and the manageable bits would be for each enterprise, each key enterprise, to develop this famous state ownership policy that is subscribed by a broader community of stakeholders, and then you delegate the implementation of the plans and the strategy to realize that state ownership objectives to the independent, competent board. If you create, a la Erdogan, $300 billion thing, and put yourself and your son-in-law in the executive management, you report to yourself, fantastic thing, but I don't think it works.
Lean structure, no? Пан Андрію, ви хотіли відкоментувати?
Mr. Andriy, would you like to comment upon that? Yes, a short comment. I totally agree with what was mentioned, that we shouldn't wait for privatization or the creation of supervisory board. We should reform and modernize now, because we are getting wages for that now, to prepare the bank and to do whatever we can do. At the example of Oshchadbank, we were not waiting for the change of the corporate governance system. We understood that sooner or later it will take place. We cannot avoid that, and we shouldn't. In 2014, we began a very precise analysis of the corporate guidance which creates the system of risk management in the whole Europe, and to implement it into the system of the governance of the bank, where it can be done by the board. We began it for the veto right and the risk management department. Of course, this veto totally escalates the issue on the level of the supervisory board. This is the first point. Secondly, we had some other points, of course. I will not list them. As for the social status, a very short illustration for you to understand what we're speaking about. Slovyansk liberation. 48 hours passed, and a Oshchadbank outlet renewed its activities there after the liberation, and the pensions went there. The country came back there. Ukrainian authorities came back. The status came back there. We came there together with the Minister of Interior, the head of Ukrainian Automobile Commission, and the head of Ukrainian Railways. And the third point, the state status is very expensive. Oshchadbank has lost, because of the annexation of Crimea, in an instant 24 billion hryvnia of the assets which we had in the Crimea. If the rest commercial banks in this or that way could mitigate or minimize their losses, I will not mention about that, because you know how it was done. We could not do that. Everything, up till the last penny, was taken. We left everything there, and we went to the International Commercial Arbitrage, the first Ukrainian state-owned company which had the full procedure of the International Commercial Arbitrage Court. And now we are a step ahead, and we try to have the solution which I hope will be positive. There is a question here.
Yes, Ina Petrashko, INTL Stone. My question is to Kateryna, if I may. In one of your comments, you did mention that one of the reasons of slower privatizations and one of the problems that currently exist in Ukraine is the fact that international markets are closed.
It's fact of what, sorry?
International markets are closed.
Okay.
So I'd like to come from the other side. Our company holds an FCA license which is equal to investment bank. We are not a bank though. We did attempt multiple times to discuss with banks and other financial organizations in Ukraine to do business. And the answer was, because we are not a bank, we cannot do business with you, even though we do like what you offer. So my question is, Are there any attempts or maybe already some work towards working in changing the regulations, or maybe even further, like a mutual recognition of the rules and regulation between Europe and Ukraine? Thank you.
Дивіться, перше, я
Well, look, first of
коли
all,
говорила про
when I spoke
зовнішні
about
ринки,
the external
я не говорю,
markets,
що вони
I was not
закриті.
speaking they're closed.
Я говорю про те,
No.
що сьогодні
I said that
наші компанії
our companies,
українські
Ukrainian companies,
не мають такого
do not
вільного
have
туди
such a
доступу
free
в силу
access to it
цілого ряду
because of
обставин,
lots of
включаючи як
different
наші
conditions,
внутрішні,
including our
так і певні
internal
зміни
conditions and
і
certain
ситуації, яка
changes and
відбувається на
situations
зовнішніх
which is
ринках,
taking place at the
особливо
external markets,
щодо
especially
зацікавленості
as for
інвесторів
the interest
в
of the
ринках країн
investors in the
або
markets
в інвестиціях в країни, що
or
розвиваються.
investments of the
Тому це
developing countries.
вони не закриті,
They're
але
not closed,
це, скажімо так,
but I'd
можливості
say
вільного
there's an
доступу
opportunities of
дещо
free
обмежені. Це
access which are
перше.
rather restricted.
Друге, що стосовно
Secondly, as
потенційної
for the
можливості змінити
potential
регулювання.
opportunity to change the
Дивіться,
regulations.
за останні
Look, during the last
3 чи 4 роки
3 or 4 years,
Національний банк,
the National Bank,
ну, мені здається,
it
зробив
seems to me,
величезну
has
роботу,
conducted
яка
a huge job,
зазвичай вона знаходиться
which is
поза,
mostly beyond.
ну, вона не є на перших
Well,
шпальтах,
it's not
про
on the
це не
first
пишуть
pages of the
кожного дня,
newspapers,
але
it's
ми
not
дуже
written in
багато
the
уваги
media every day,
приділяємо
but we pay lots of attention to
дерегуляції,
deregulation,
зміни наших
the
регуляцій
changes of our
і адаптації
regulations
її
and
до нових
adjustments
бізнес-умов,
towards the new
аби
business
спростити
conditions, to simplify
розвиток бізнесу,
the development of business,
притік інвестицій і
the
таке інше.
flow of
Тому
the
моя відповідь
flow
буде так.
of the investments.
Це можливо,
So, I would
проте
answer,
про це
it
треба
is
говорити
possible,
конкретніше,
but we
можливо,
need to
не на
speak
таку
more
широку
precise,
аудиторію,
maybe
треба
not with such a
зрозуміти
wide audience, because we need to
детальніше
understand
кейс
the
і
detailed
тоді
case,
про це
and
говорити. Якщо
then
це
we can speak
дійсно
about that.
є
If
якісь
it's
такі
really
перешкоди,
a kind of an
які,
obstacle,
скажімо,
which
не є принциповими
is not
з
that
точки
principle
зору регулювання ринку
from
в
the
цілому,
point of
проте
view of the market
перешкоджають
regulation,
входженню
but
нових
still interferes
гравців
into the new
або
players
розвитку
emerging
якихось нових послуг,
or the
або нових
development of new
напрямків, то,
services,
звичайно, ми готові
then of course
подивитися
we
і
are ready to
змінити.
look at
Ми вже
that and
дуже
to
багато
change that.
змінили,
We've
і
changed a lot
не тільки
already,
на
and
банківському
not
ринку,
only at
але й
the
на інших
banking
суміжних,
sector, but
де ми
other
є
similar sectors
регулятором
where we are the
другої руки,
regulator
так би
of,
мовити, тому
so
є
to
послуги,
say,
які ми
second
ліцензуємо
term.
і їх не надають
So we
банки,
are
тому ми
licensing some
готові
of the
до
services.
змін, тому що все,
We
що
are
ми
ready
робимо,
for the changes because
тільки для
everything
того,
what
аби
we
країна
do
була
is
більш
created for our country to be more
привабливою для
attractive
інвесторів,
for
для
the
інвестицій,
investors, for the
і
investments,
щоб економіка зростала.
and for the economy growth. Thank
Є ще
you.
запитання
Are
з
there
залу?
any other questions left? Yes, please. Dmytro Shimkiv.
I have a question to Ivan, because in general we have a lot of discussion over the last years in Ukraine about abolishing completely state-owned enterprises, as eliminated as a concept. But as Andriy already mentioned, somebody has to serve on freed territories. Somebody has to deliver posts to the villages where there is no profitability. Somebody has to offer a credit or financial resources to strike a General Electric deal, because all other banks were not capable. I understand there could be a competition, but it will increase significantly costs for the state. So if we eliminate the function of the state-owned enterprises, which is cheap for the state, who can perform this function? Oh, and will there be companies willing to perform function not generating any revenue?
Yeah, firstly, I spoke about banks, that I don't see any reason to have commercial state-owned banks, which doesn't mean that no state-owned companies. Of course, especially in natural monopoly, it is better to have state-owned natural monopoly than private state-owned monopoly. But, and of course, then there are some specific areas, like maybe military, maybe some military research that could be, but it is exceptional. In my opinion, there are different opinions. Some people are saying, oh, it has to be much more. My opinion is that it is very limited where really it is necessary to have. Regarding these functions, even this, it is calling public interest service, which is possible. It is possible that if state want to do something, for instance, this post service, also in the areas which are remote, which is more costly, state can order this. State can order this, and if it will be ordered by competition, by private companies, I'm sure that you have better chance that it will be cheaper than if it is doing one company which has monopoly for this. But it is possible. It is not theory, it works like that in some countries, just in some countries. But also speaking about banks, yeah, we have in Slovakia we have some special banks, but they have special kind of goal. We have credit small bank which is giving some support for a small business, yeah. But it is special. It is not a general commercial bank. We have Exim Bank, which has specific, and they are state-owned, but not fully fledged commercial banks. There is no reason for to have, in my opinion, and this again, not many countries. Even we don't have, when we did this privatization, we didn't have any one Slovak privately owned bank. All commercial banks in Slovakia have been foreign owned. Now we have in first 10, 7, 8, and 9 biggest banks, which means not the biggest, are private owned, which have been developed from nothing. Yeah. Which means in this area, I'm really convinced that you don't need. Principle is important, and it's the same principle. It is every government has to have social policy. Okay, let's say like that. But it doesn't. But the worst case how to do this is by deforming market. For instance, by deforming price, which means regulate the gas price is the worst possible way how to do social policy. Much better is to have market price, market conditions, and then to subsidize those who need help, which means not on the side of revenues, but on the side of expenditures. And this logic, in my opinion, is possible solve also in these social functions which government has to have. Nothing against. It is clear that government has to have, especially these occupied territories, especially also these remote areas, and so on and so on.
Thank you. If I may add, Şevki, may I go first? Okay. I think, Dmitry, the price for state getting these functions from state-owned banks now is a bit calculated erroneously, because it's not just they're just not paying now for that. Yeah. And if you have, OECD-style governance of state-owned enterprises and banks, you are supposed to, let's say, not necessarily compensate it from the budget, but identify the social functions and find the ways to finance it. And then you'll know the real price.
Yeah, I think. But there's one point here, that the fact that these services have to be provided on non-economical terms, it means, as you said, somebody is paying for it already. So it's a question of making the payment process transparent by identifying, and try to save on that cost by finding the most efficient deliverer of that service through competition. I mean, that is one way of dealing with it. In all, it is not possible to do such, concrete quantification in all areas, but to the extent, if you adopt this as a philosophy, that you will try to, in a very transparent way, articulate the cost and ask for bidders, like anything else, that for a competitive process, you will save cost. The second thing I wanted to say is often, there's complaint, and I don't have my independent board, so I cannot perform well, and I'm, therefore I'm influenced by the politicians and everybody else. But the thing I think Andriy, with its partnership with EBRD, is doing is an example that you first, within your institution, set up the right structures of governance, accountability, transparency, and orient your institution towards decision-making with those structures. Easier it is than to defend the position, to ask for this extra layer of governance structure of independent board.
Thank you. Пане Андрію, ви хотіли відкоментувати?
Well, in fact, there are two aspects if we speak about the anti-terroristic operation zone, or as it's called now, joint forces operation. Two aspects. The first one, nothing interferes to 1, 2, or 10 companies to come to the gray zone and to serve it. Why aren't they coming? There are clients there. They're paying the commission. I will tell you more. I was really happy to read the statistics. And when there is an opportunity, I'm always speaking about that. When our moving vehicles, which are working at the block posts, people are bringing deposits to the Ukrainian National Bank, and they are bringing it from the territory which is not under control of Ukraine. And they do that in those two little windows of those trucks. This is the sense of the commercial mission. And this part of the exercise is conducted where we can earn and compensate, we earn and compensate. Secondly, this is the issue of safety. The issue of safety and security of the employees and funds, and we have developed it actively. It seems to me it is rather, we have a very active system of cooperation and the issue of national security, because the zone of joint forces operation is the zone where there is the war with our guys. They're getting the salary there. They get certain compensations. There is their personal data there, transaction history there. The country is in fact, at the war aggression state. The lists of the military men and women demobilized, the addresses of their relatives, and so on. I will not tell you how we are doing that, but I must tell you that it can be done not by all of the banks, taking into account certain precise restrictions. So in this part, the function of the state-owned banks is not under doubts. Undoubtedly, everybody would like to serve the refugees, 1,600,000 of the client base, but somehow they want to take refugees in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa. Why don't they serve them in Bakhmut? Why do you re-register them at the confrontation line and delimitation line? There are certain points, and with the Ministry of Finance we have an efficient dialogue that we need this client flow to compensate the losses. So this dialogue is a permanent one, and today, performing this social function, we're trying to find this point of balance between our social function and the expenses which the bank bears, performing all the requirements of the National Bank. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Yes, please, the last question now. Dmitro Kuzmin, I've got the question to Andriy and to all of the panelists. Andriy has mentioned the question of the supervisory boards and an opportunity to delegate the part of the responsibility to the supervisory board, especially as for the troubled loans, which are the biggest part of the state-owned banks. In my understanding, the new supervisory board and those experts will provide those new troubled debts not to emerge again. So as far as I understand, for an efficient work with them, the state banks have to operate as private banks. They need to restructure as for the law enforcement. So my question is, what are the tools which can be used to have an opportunity to restructure, to operate more as a private bank? And to what extent you could operate as a private bank? But of course, it's could be your own opinion. Two aspects, if I understood you correctly. First of all, the supervisory boards which will be formed, at which will gain the authorities to deal with the troubled debts. This is more of looking forward, not to have more of troubled debts, but what we should do with the past ones. And secondly, to solve the issue with the problem troubled debts, could you use the tools which the private banks are using? And how can you get them? I will begin with the second one. Unfortunately, we cannot use those mechanisms and those mechanisms of indulgence or debt release, which are done by the private banks, will again meet the guests from the law enforcement if we do that, unfortunately. This is the conclusions of our lawyers, and this is the practice which has been conducted during the last 4 years about the criminal cases which are being investigated, the violations and so on. So we're using today the unified mechanisms, which is the Kyiv approach for the restructuring of debt, which foresees the involvement of the experts, independent experts and auditors, assesses process which gives the maximum openness for the process and the substantiation of the solutions and conclusions, precise conclusions as for the impact onto the regulations of the bank and the calculation of the two alternative scenarios. What could happen if we hadn't restructured anything, and what would happen if we had conducted the restructuring? If the independent experts adopts the economic efficiency of the option which foresees restructuring of the asset with the positive economic effect, then undoubtedly we will look at that and then we'll structure the contracts. As for the other question, to give the part of to delegate the responsibility to the supervisory board, well, you know, in fact, all of those decisions, no, I will begin differently. So, during the process of the checks, which we had conducted during the last 4 years in Oshchadbank, the conclusions included the formulation that the board of Oshchadbank has been delegated with lots of authorities, but it has used it for modernization and reforms of the bank. There were no abuse and violations. It's true, we were delegated lots of authorities, and the board has done a lot thanks to that. I consider that was a push forward as for modernization and reforms. But as for the issue of toxic portfolio, then here, you know, we would like to share this responsibility and maybe the qualification, to involve additional qualification, because, you know, those are really complicated cases, both as for their volume and about their interests, conflicts of interests and possible consequences. So we would like for this qualified supervisory board to be involved in this process. Moreover, it's their direct function, how to avoid the troubled debts portfolio. So the credit policy is also the authority of supervisory board. I will try to be short to add. Look, the use by the state banks of the same toolkit which is used by the commercial banks in the process of restructuring has never been banned by the law. So it's more the question for our law enforcement, because whatever we do, it's always a bad thing. So Dmitry, during the previous panel discussion, said the nice thing that transparency is the best medicine for the people who see corruption everywhere. The Kyiv approach is a very transparent ground, and the transparent procedure, which is a public one. This is the first one, the protection for the state-owned banks, for the management which takes decisions. Secondly, I do hope there will see independent supervisory boards. And the third, we do understand this issue, and not only that we need to restructure, to clean the balance and to let people work more, but it's needed for the economy, because those enterprises are working. They need the cash flow, but they cannot get it because it's in the legacy. So we have such a ground, which is called the Council of the Financial Sustainability, where we, together with the Ministry of Finance, came to the conclusion to create an additional ground, which would consider the issues of restructuring of troubled debts in the state-owned banks and to give certain recommendations. And again, it's transparency. This is the teamwork on the decision-making process, and 100% the banks can be calm and quiet, because this is again the protection for them as for the possible accusations of certain violations. Thank you. I think that we should conclude, though, of course, we could go on with this discussion not only in here, but our time is up, so we would like to breathe fresh air. So for me, these are the issues and some of the answers which need to be at the state policy of state ownership. But what's important, as for me, thanks to this discussion, we understood that the existing strategy of the state-owned banks is an important document, and obviously where it's heading for, but it's not a 100% similarity of the state-ownership policy, because the issue of social function is still debatable. The second point, the reform of the state-owned banks and enterprises were simultaneous or parallel in the majority of cases. But out of what I hear, it's time, finally, and we have a request to unite them, because we have the understanding that the conduction of the development strategy of the state banks without the increase of the level of corporate governance in the monopolies, or without the definition what's going on with the strategy of the governance on the state-owned enterprises, would be either complicated or impossible. So now I hope that when the law is adopted on the state-owned banks, the whole team, both of the Ministry of Finance and the National Bank and the state-owned banks, will join the work on the promotion of the law on the increase of corporate governance in the state-owned companies, and join the work on the overall state ownership policy for the whole sector, which will include and answer all the questions about those interconnections. So when you privatize the state-owned banks, how you fund the state-owned enterprises and perform the social functions which we discussed here. I thank you so much for your attention, and I do invite you to have further discussions. Thank you.